Okay. Let me just find. Hang on a minute, sorry. Sorry, it's just my sharing isn't working at the moment for some reason. I think that's right. Just bear with me a minute.
Depending on what program you're using, Emma, there should be a share screen button at the bottom.
Yeah, I can see that, but for some reason it's not letting me connect to what I want to share. Right, here it is now.
There we go.
Right,
Perfect.
That now appeared. Yes, about that technical incompetence, everybody.
Perfect. Over to you.
Okay. Okay, so what I wanted to think about in relation to this idea of the haunted metropolis in this particular period, these are some of the areas that I'm going to be thinking about. So I'm going to start off thinking about the concept of dark London, which has been a term that's been discussed quite a lot in Gothic studies, and to think about how that might be relevant to the modernist period. And then I'm going to look at these issues in relation to a couple of women writers, Marie Belloc-Lowndes and Violet Hunt. So I'll think a bit about how their writing reflects the influence of crime and sensation journalism at this time, and how they include in their stories these sort of key scenes of traversing the city by taxi and on foot. And I'll finish off by talking a bit about the London fog and how that fits in with ideas of spectrality. So if we start off thinking about this concept of dark London, it's a term that was used in the subtitle of Sarah Wasson's book about urban Gothic of the Second World War, and she talks in fascinating ways in this text about how wartime texts of the late 1930s and 1940s construct the city as a hallucinatory, claustrophobic and labyrinthine realm, writing topical anxieties into the wartime streets. And she talks about the metropolis in relation to violence and anonymity, sexual and criminal transgression. And she's showing how these representations of the city, of blackout London and all its strangeness, are showing particular anxieties about class and capital linked to the city's diurnal duality. And this idea about the sort of geography of Gothic London is something that a number of Gothic critics have picked up on. In other texts, Linda Dryden also talks about it as well in her book on the fin de siècle. She talks there about Victorian London being a symbolic space of light and dark, both real and imagined, an alienating environment figured in terms of a Gothic duality. And these critics do draw on ideas about this metropolitan duality, but this is not always connected to the figure of the woman writer. So that was something that I was really interested in looking at in my work, and to thinking about how we could sort of apply some of these ideas about the darkness of the city to the modernist period, that maybe there's been slightly less to say about modernist Gothic, and that we need to sort of think again about the city in this period. You know, at this time of great urbanisation, the city has an East End, West End divide, and a rapidly expanding commercial centre, greater immigration, and those are all sort of impacting on sort of representations of overcrowding and darkness, and these social inequalities that I was interested in looking at in stories of the 1910s and the 1920s. Carl Bell, who's a historian who's worked in really fascinating ways on the idea of the supernatural city, suggests that this is still something that is woefully understudied. He says something that we need to do more work on as historians and critics. And he talks about this concept of spectrality, saying that it provides glimpses into hidden geographies within the known city. Those ideas of knowability and unknowability, I think, become very important to ways of understanding the city. He talks about the threatening inhabitants of cities, and how ghostliness can sort of draw attention to other spaces in the urban environment or other social groups, but those can also be linked to this fragility of the individual in modernity. So in my work, I've tried to pick up on some of these ideas about that fragility of the individual, but particularly the fragility of the woman, to put gender back into some of these conversations about the supernatural city and the modern woman, who's often very much associated with modernism, but not always associated with the modernist ghost story. So that's something that I've been trying to work on recently. If you're interested in reading a little bit more about these ideas of the London fog that I'll talk about in more detail later, this is a great anthology here in the British Library, Tales of the Weird series. I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But some of the writers that I talk about, some of their work is featured in this collection, though I think the two stories in there are not the ones that I'm talking about now, but it's really recommended. And I've just put an image here. You'll see quite a few images on the slides of the city being represented in quite a ghostly, strange, or sort of dark way. But I like this one because it was one of Manchester, where I am right now, that it's not all London being the supernatural city at this time. This is an image from 1910 by Villette, where you can see what would have been a familiar Manchester Square, very near where some of us work, but the figures become indistinct and strange. The buildings are shadowed and become more uncanny, but there's also within the scene the kind of people just going about their everyday work, and conveying people around the city. You can see sort of part of that crowd in the background. So perhaps some of those ideas of threat or fragility might be encoded in the scene somewhere, that some of these stories are responding to. And the ghost story also overlaps in really interesting ways with crime fiction around the turn of the century and into the 20th century. You may know the work of Claire Clark, who's written a couple of really interesting books about detective fiction around this time, and showing about these border crossings that are really important for understanding short fiction. At the turn of the century, how ghost stories and Gothic overlap with slum novels and detective stories, and that they draw on the same kind of iconography of the foggy London streets and the hansom cabs, gaslight, gentlemen's clubs, those details that people kind of relish in a Sherlock Holmes story, but those kind of details were used in lots of different ways by different writers at the time, some of whom were imitating the Sherlock Holmes stories, or were seen as the successors, as Clarke suggests here, but also how stories at the time are being used to illuminate social and political concerns of the era, like the poverty in London slums, or concerns about female empowerment, or the interest in spiritualism that we also have, sort of revival of that at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. So, you know, I'm interested in this idea about the ghost story as having these sort of political messages at the time, and maybe responding in different ways to these socio-political concerns. So I'll introduce you to the two authors that I'm going to be talking about today. Some of you may be familiar with some of them, maybe not. So Marie Belloc-Lowndes, born in 1868. She worked as a journalist for the scandalous evening paper, the Pall Mall Gazette, with the well-known editor W.T. Stead. So she sort of trained on his paper before building a career primarily as a writer of crime fiction is what she's known for, but she also wrote ghost stories and biographies of royal figures, and was quite a prolific author in her day. You may know her as the author of The Lodger, story and short novel from 1911 and 1913, which was the first fictional adaptation of the Jack the Ripper story from the 1880s, and also adapted as a silent movie in 1927. It is a great story, and there's quite a lot of fog in that story, but I'm not going to talk about that very much today. She was also a member of the Women Writers' Suffrage League from this period, and was involved in the suffrage campaign, so that she worked with Hunt and other writers of the era like Elizabeth Robbins to kind of try to use their position as women writers to promote the suffrage cause. So you can certainly see that as a strand within her stories. So the other figure, perhaps less well known, is Violet Hunt, who is here with one of her gravity-defying Edwardian hats. I don't know how that balances on top of that hairdo, but you know, it looks great. So she was a well-known New Woman novelist of her era and journalist, but also quite well known as a literary hostess. She's often sort of more famous for who she knew and her connections to famous men. She's often talked about much more as the lover of Ford Madox Ford and H.G. Wells. But she was also quite an important friend of Henry James, and you can see letters between those two that are really interesting, and conversations that they had about ghost stories. She talks about in the preface to her second collection. She was also in the Women Writers' Suffrage League, one of the co-founders in 1908, and she did know Marie Belloc-Lowndes. I'm going to talk about these two neglected collections, Tales of the Uneasy and More Tales of the Uneasy. And Henry James did help her with that title, that idea of the uneasy tale. They were trying to find the right adjective and sort of going through macabre and uncanny. And then they came up with uneasy, which is interesting in itself. In her memoir that I recently reread, there's an interesting scene where she talks about being at this Sunday evening gathering at the house of Edward Clodd, the anthropologist. And Thomas Hardy was also present at this event, that they spent the Sunday evening in the library talking ghost stories and raving and sentimentalizing about apparitions and the survival of consciousness after death. So I thought that was quite a nice idea, that they were getting together to rave about apparitions, but also sort of reflecting on you know, the spiritualist movement and the kinds of materials that they would use in their own ghostwriting. Thomas Hardy, you know, like James, also produced really good ghost stories in this period. So after this 1909 evening, both of these women writers would go on to publish their first collections of ghost stories. That Lowndes also publishes one in the 1910s. So I wonder whether this is some kind of a pivotal moment, or certainly something that they're both thinking about at the time. So I'm going to talk mainly about one story by each of these writers and just try to link it to these different influences and ways of thinking about the metropolis at this time. But there are obviously other stories that you could look at. So I'm going to start explaining a little bit about the sensation journalism that may have influenced Lowndes' story, the woman from Purgatory, that she had, as I said earlier, worked for W.T. Stead, who's known as a famous journalist and an editor of the period, and that she, I think, draws on some of the ways in which he talks about the city and the way in which the city is talked about in crime writing, that it within what can be called sensation journalism of this period, which was selling papers because of its sort of lurid images. Ideas about homelessness and prostitution were sort of publicized in terms of these tropes of hellishness and horror and darkness. So you can see, if you glance at some of these short articles here, which you can have a look at on this website, Attacking the Devil, that gathers together some of Stead's work, that these images stand out, where Stead is talking about outcast London, the London of kind of poverty and the slums where the poor are outcasted. He talks about that in terms of excess, but he's also talking about the slums in terms of evil, and how that's widespread. In his famous expose of child prostitution, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, he again talks about this phenomenon in terms of horror, a horror 1,000 times more horrible than that which haunted like a nightmare the imagination of mankind. So this sort of nightmarish horror that attends poverty, and the sort of dangerous effects of slum life. And in relation to the Ripper crimes in the third article there, he's talking about the fate of the children in the city is the climax of horror, the kinds of women who don't have the kind of children who don't have the stable family background. He talks about it in terms of this appalling tragedy beside which all other horrors pale and disappear. So this sort of language of horror that infiltrates the journalism of this period of horror and evil are really sort of common ways of talking about London in particular at this time. And there's just an example here from one of the many reports about the atrocities of Jack the Ripper that are associated with the East End in the 1880s and 1890s, when Lowndes would have been working on Stead's team at the Pall Mall Gazette. An example here of one of the discovery of one of the bodies is always framed in terms of this darkness. It's a sort of example of dark London. So I've just highlighted some phrases there about being no light within the building, that the body's quite in the dark. People walk past a body lying there because it's not unusual. The cab driver's so tired, he doesn't care whether the person's alive or dead. This female lying in a pool of blood is a stranger. So that sort of darkness is being linked to ideas of estrangement, I think, in the city, and people not knowing each other, and that the dangers of, you know, limited, inadequate housing and poor lighting. All of those sort of images seem to be sort of pulled through into some of the ghost stories, I think, of the time. There are a couple of examples here of how female suicides were also presented in kind of the fin de siècle press. There's quite a lot of images of female suicide in some of the stories that these women writers produce, and there's also a sort of technique of borrowing this kind of language, but also borrowing the format of the crime report. So often in ghost stories you'll see a sort of embedded crime report, as if the reader is sort of reading the ghost story alongside the crime report. Those languages sort of mesh. So in here you can see how the crime of suicide is also associated to poverty, distress, the kind of extremeness of poverty in the 1892 report that you can see here. Suicides linked to ideas about degradation and insanity, but also the kind of the bad behavior of men, the male brutality or abandonment has sort of impacted on these women, who are then sort of found at the mercy of the city almost in these reports. And to me it seems that Lowndes was very much influenced by this kind of reporting. As I've said, she was a producer of crime fiction herself, so that certainly kind of leaks into the ghost stories that she writes. So this is the story that I wanted to make a few points about, which I'd really recommend if you wanted to read more by this author, called The Woman from Purgatory, from her collection Studies in Love and in Terror, which are not all ghost stories within this collection, but they are all quite dark, and they could all fit into that category of tales of the uneasy. I think by the time you're looking at the modernist ghost story, there's not necessarily a deliberate spectre figure that you can identify in the story, but there's always a lot of uneasiness and uncanniness going on, though there are definite ghosts in this story here. So it's the story of a suburban mother called Agnes Barlow, who reads about the suicide of her school friend, Teresa Mulder, which is reproduced in the article within the ghost story, as I was saying earlier, is a technique. So suicide of a lady at Dover. And the friend is a runaway wife who, instead of leading the gloriously careless life with her lover, which Agnes had imagined, had thrown herself out of a hotel window. The story then follows Agnes to Chelsea for a possible assignation with a male friend, in which she's twice confronted by Teresa's ghost. So I was interested in how the ghost is represented here in this story, and how we might read this particular scene. So the story is influenced by Lowndes' devout Catholicism, as you might imagine from the title of the story. And in the story you do see London as a kind of purgatorial space, again, which is sort of quite typical of some modernist London texts, as my colleague Matt Foley has talked about in his book on modernist ghosts. And she seems to follow through that idea of purgatorial space in this story of the dark London scene that we're presented with. The kind of idea of fallenness and horror is very much sort of borrowed from the journalism of the time. As Agnes is walking through Chelsea from the railway station, we come across this scene, a figure that emerges from the darkness. It says what had seemed to be her dead friend's dark glowing face was the face of a little child, a black-haired beggar child with large startled eyes wide open on a living world. The tall woman, whose statuesque figure had strangely recalled Teresa's supple, let's get that off the screen, supple, powerful form, was holding up the child, propping it on a wall behind her. This queer illusion of this ghostly, melancholy group is what appears strange to me. It's fusing this sort of poverty and abandonment of women. The stranger then begs for money. I haven't a penny left. I came to find my husband, but he's lost himself on purpose. So what she initially thinks is the ghost of her friend, then turns out to be a black-haired beggar child, but also a beggar mother within this scene, and this creates the sense of a queer illusion. It's a woman who is then begging for money, so that the ghostly encounter is linked to this grinding poverty that's familiar from slum fiction and from crime reports of the time. So it seems that Lowndes is sort of making a point about the lost suicidal woman, but also the dangers of what can happen to women in the city. So all three women perhaps seem to occupy this role of the woman from Purgatory: the beggar mother, the child, the suicide, Agnes herself. So maybe that's four women, that they're all sort of collectively occupying this purgatorial space within the city, which I find sort of interesting to look at, and how readers might have responded to that at the time. So if I move on to Violet Hunt's story that I'd like to contrast before I bring them both together, this other story that I want to look at is called The Night of No Weather from 1925. And this is a story about the nervous Ethna Aragon, great name, quite Jamesian maybe, who's an aging social butterfly, like quite a lot of Violet Hunt's heroines in her stories. And in the story, she moves between her newly inhabited flat, a grand ball in Belgrave Square, and her former home, Westerly Lodge. But the story is really ambiguous and interesting because of the protagonist's spectral status, and the uncertainties there. We're not sure if it's a ghost speaking or a suicidal woman slowly dying. By the end of the story, we're told that Ethna had taken poison in her new flat, but we're not quite sure about the point of death. It's very difficult to work this out. If you look at the quotation at the bottom here, which is from Violet Hunt's preface to More Tales of the Uneasy, which is a really interesting reflection on ghost stories and spiritualism, and that sort of uneasiness of the borderland ghosts. There she's sort of privileging the borderland ghost over out and out spectres, maybe the more obvious visible Victorian type of ghosts. You can't always put your finger on these ghosts in the modernist story in quite the same sort of way. So you're not sure about the kind of ghostly status for most of the time that you're reading this story. But this is a quotation from quite early on in the story, from the beginning, how the scene is being set, which is interesting in terms of showing this figure of the modern woman. At midnight, she would be careering round and round the misty masses of shrubs called squares, along the echoing empty streets of sightless, unlit houses, till at last her conveyance would draw up at one great lighted portal or another. She then goes into the ballroom, and this is the kind of language that's used. In the suffocating whirlpool of slowly gyrating bodies, Ethna feels like an empty chair. To avoid catching the eye of a socially useless person, they just look through her. It was a horrible sensation. She felt as if she were a dead person watching the ways of the humanity she'd so recently cut off. So she's moving through the city in the early scenes of the story, but that's kind of given a sort of darker edge. You notice those sort of misty masses of the trees, which sound quite ominous, the sightless houses. There's always a kind of the language of emptiness in lots of these stories by these two women writers. So we've got the empty streets, and Ethna feeling like an empty chair. Rented accommodation always described as empty. Rooms are empty. The London streets, you always described in these terms. But Hunt is sort of emphasising this sort of plight of the marginalised single woman. Ethna is someone whose mother has just died in this story and who's been tricked out of her property and her inheritance and is feeling useless. So that's the position in the ballroom, like a wallflower that nobody wants to look in the eye. That's that sort of horrible sensation. But whether she is really dead or not, we're not quite sure. When Victoria Margry, who's one of the critics who's looked at Violet Hunt's ghost stories, most people don't look at them. She talks about how her stories, the ghosts often pass for the living, which I think is a nice phrase. So this may be an example of this kind of story, that it's a ghost who's passing for the living and has just gone to attend a ball, but is then sort of adding to that sort of idea of the dance of death, almost, about being caught up in this whirlpool of bodies, a suffocating crowd. And those again are the sort of the language of the degenerationist city that's you often see also in modernist writing of the time. So we could think about Hunt's writing in relation to ideas of Flannery, these ideas about women crossing the city. It's quite a lot going on in this slide, I'm afraid. I'll just sort of break some of it down. So I was sort of inspired by what Elizabeth Bromford talks about in her book called Night Passages, which takes a sort of philosophical look at ideas of darkness and night in different media. And she has a chapter about ideas of Flannery, where she looks at this figure of the nocturnal flaneur. She just only talks about a male figure in relation to Poe. And she says to traverse the urban night without restraint is to arrive both everywhere and nowhere. You know, those sort of dangers of traversing and whether it takes you into a kind of nothingness that's not so liberating as we might imagine. So I tried to think about this figure of the nocturnal flaneurs, a figure who perhaps appears in quite a lot of these modern stories by Hunt and Lowndes, which are often set in London, where both of those authors mainly lived and worked. And I sort of noticed also how these women often travel by taxi, particularly in Hunt's stories. You may know her other ghost story called The Telegram, which I don't have time to talk about today, from 1911, in which a telegram is sent across the city to tell the woman of her lover's illness, but actually the ghost is also traveling across the city at the same time, his ghost in a taxi, which he doesn't pay for, which makes the cab driver very upset. So this sort of idea about ghosts possibly traveling by taxis in Hunt's stories, I find quite interesting. It's a time when more women were starting to use taxis and to travel on their own. You can see in these images here, which I've borrowed from this fabulous website called World of Taxis. You know, check it out. There's a punch image from the later 19th century, the woman's face just looking out of the cab there, and the cabbies trying not to swear because they're driving a lady. But also in the advert there, I think this is a Canadian advert, the figure of the modern woman with her telephone, obviously going out for a night on the town, going out, is calling for a taxi and being associated with modernity, and the sort of interesting discussions about, you know, what sort of freedoms the taxi might give to the modern woman at this time, and how that might be then slightly sort of skewed if you're thinking about these spectral passengers within the taxi cab itself, the nocturnal flaneurs occupying that zone. So I'll just move on. This is the final section now, just a few more minutes to talk about fog, which is just a key trope of a lot of these stories that I'm looking at, and also by the, you know, other writers of the time. Fog helps to sort of set up the city as this place of loneliness and alienation, sort of separating people from each other. That there's really interesting work that's been done on London fog by historians and cultural critics, who are responding to stories and artwork of the period, like this Whistler image that you have here, the nocturne, the night scene. Christine Corton, in her excellent book, talks about fog as being a metaphorical expression for the social threat looming over the metropolis, and links it to the slums that I mentioned earlier, the filth and squalor of the East End. That idea about fog-bound Whitechapel, which is the scene of the Ripper murders. Bill Luckin talks about it in relation to poverty and deprivation, and the sort of degenerationist anti-urban discourses of the time, that the fog is linked to this sort of dirt and disorientation of the city, the kind of horror of what he calls those great London fogs, the pea supers, where people literally found it impossible to walk around London. And there's lots of fabulous cartoons and images of this at the time. Hunt also talks about the London fogs in her memoir, and how they weren't just a winter phenomenon, that they did appear in spring as well, and in the daytime, not just at night, sort of muddling those categories of night and day, which is sort of part of that idea of dark London. I think there's just a couple more images here to show you how artists were representing the fog at the time, a little bit like that Manchester one from earlier on, that sort of fascination of how to sort of aestheticize fog, but how it also appears in stories, what sort of purposes it might serve in the ghost story. This is another really interesting book that I've recently come across, that was recommended to me last time I gave this paper, that I didn't know, by Jessie Oak Taylor, which takes a sort of eco-critical approach to the London fog, which is really interesting, that he talks again about how the fog frequently turns towards the spectral, and what's the purpose of this in relation to environmental pollution. He talks about pollution as both a literal substance and a defining attribute of industrial modernity. Again, he uses quite a lot of male authors, apart from Virginia Woolf, so doesn't always talk about these sort of gendered aspects. Christine Corton talks a little bit more about this, about fog obviously increasing the sense of threat for women, and women being sort of vulnerable or alienated in the city. And just wanted to link this to a couple of scenes in these two stories that I'm looking at. So Violet Hunt's story, The Night of No Weather, which is, a strange title in itself. This is the ballroom story, but by the end of it, Ethna has returned to Westerly Lodge, her former home, which is now occupied by her dead mother, and in the garden, her mummified pets, who were sort of described in great detail about kind of there and not there. It's quite a weird scene, her return to this house in the middle of the night. We're told time and space were not, which sort of carries those weird connotations. And the narrator says, in a London night of no weather, lightish but still night, there's no wind or rain, just the cold gleaming pavements, like a night in fairyland. So it's almost like a sort of enchanted scene, but that idea of having a night of no weather, I find quite a strange image. These sort of references to this strange darkness is quite interesting, I think. And that Hunt is also writing after the First World War, so you do get these sort of traces in some of her stories about wartime London, linking back to Wasson's views from earlier on, a sort of blackout London. She has one of her stories in this collection called The Cigarette Case of the Commander, which does talk about the danger zone of London and the loss of light. So interesting what that fog might represent in these stories. And just the last slide or so, now just wanted to return you to Marie Bellot-Lowndes' story, The Woman from Purgatory, of Agnes moving through the city. Again, at this point, she's on her way to her lover's house. You notice how this sort of concentration on the idea of the London fog now. She couldn't help being glad the fog was of that dense, stifling quality, which makes everyone intent on his own business rather than that of his neighbours. When she's accosted by an overfamiliar man, she feels shaken with fear, disgust and terror. She was not often alone in London. She'd never been there alone on such a foggy evening, an evening which invited such approaches as those she just repulsed. She thrilled with angry fear lest that brute should still be stalking her. But when she looks behind her, the pavement's bare. Then she arrives at a dangerous crossroads and questions which of those shadowy black-coated figures hurrying past would direct her rightly. So it's, even though she's also a nocturnal flaneuse, that she's trying to move through the foggy scene, she's sort of terrified and disgusted and fearful and alienated by the darkness, even though she's kind of using it in order to sort of triumph over her loneliness. Again, this is sort of a way of thinking about the purgatorial space. And the last slide now, once she arrives at the dwelling place of her lover, this ideas about fog are also present, but the fog has seeped into the house. Jessie Oak Taylor says, moving through the fog-shrouded city, not frogs, is to be at once isolated and interpenetrated alone with others' exhalations, something that's linked to pollution and dirty secrets. So that sort of isolation of being in the fog is also present inside. Quite a lot of these stories show the fog coming over the threshold. And when she goes up the stairs in her lover's house towards the end of the story, she sees the second ghost of her suicidal friend, which seems as if fashioned by some potent incantation from the vaporous fog outside. A tall grey figure rose out of nothingness and stood barring the way. The sisterly love of which Agnes had been so little worthy had broken down the gateless barrier which stretches its dense length between the living and the dead woman had come back to do for her. She stared with fearful, fascinated eyes at the immobile figure swathed in grey, seer-like garments. Her gaze travelled to her face. At the end of the story, we're told through the fog she plunged, not even sparing a moment to look back and up at the dimly lighted window behind which poor Ferrier stood. So the ghost returns here to warn Agnes against taking her infidelity further, and she returns to her suburban husband at the end of the story. But that plunging into the fog towards the end, there is a sort of maybe a sign of her sort of triumph over the city, or using the fog to sort of cover her tracks, which I find quite interesting. That we're here sort of told that she's been saved by the suicidal figure, so that maybe she's rescued from that foggy in-betweenness of the purgatorial city. So hopefully looking at these two stories together has sort of made us rethink some ideas about dark London and how it might be relevant to our understandings of the modernist ghost story. If we look at these neglected modernist ghost stories, we can see how they're drawing on these ideas of horror and evil from scandal journalism, but are also thinking about the loneliness of London, about London as a sort of purgatorial space, where women can perhaps try to help each other, but are also drawn to the sort of dangers of poverty in the dark corners. In the alienating metropolis, poverty and the temptations of sexuality seem to be prevalent, but something that women have to negotiate. But maybe if we think again about some of these images, it might give us new ways of looking at the darkness of the city and its links to women's alienation and solitude. Okay, thank you.
Emma, thank you so much. I'm just trying to turn off the recording.